The slow collapse of the Western Roman Empire. By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire had not collapsed. It hadn't fallen apart. It hadn't even stopped functioning. From the outside, it still looked enormous, organized, and intimidating. Roads were maintained, taxes were collected, armies marched, emperors issued laws, coins, and orders in Rome's name. If you stood in a city like Milan, Trier, or Rome itself, the idea that the empire was nearing its end would have sounded ridiculous. And that was the problem. Rome did not collapse because everyone saw it coming. It collapsed because, for a very long time, it didn't feel like collapse at all. In 284 AD, a man named Diocletian became emperor. When he took power, the empire was exhausted. For decades, Rome had been trapped in a cycle of crisis. Emperors rose and fell quickly, often murdered by their own troops. Inflation had wrecked the currency. Borders were under constant pressure. Entire provinces had stopped trusting the central government. Diocletian did not panic. He reorganized. His solution was simple and massive. Rome was too big for one person to manage. So instead of fixing the system, he multiplied it. He split the empire into administrative halves. Then he split authority again. 4 rulers governed together in a system called the tetrarchy. Each had a court, an army, a bureaucracy, and a capital. Power was spread out so no single failure could destroy everything. On paper, this worked beautifully. The empire became more efficient. Taxes were standardized. Census records were updated. Laws became more detailed, more precise, more controlling. People were counted, classified, and assigned obligations based on profession and land. Farmers were tied to their fields. Sons were expected to follow their fathers' jobs. Movement became restricted. Rome was stabilizing itself by freezing society in place. To support the army, taxes increased, not just in money, but in goods. Grain, livestock, cloth, tools. Villages were required to meet quotas whether harvests were good or bad. Local officials were held personally responsible if payments fell short. This created a quiet pressure that never stopped. Landowners squeezed farmers. Farmers abandoned land. Abandoned land produced nothing. That made the tax burden heavier on whoever remained. Rome responded by tightening enforcement. More laws, more inspectors, more punishments for failure. None of this felt like collapse. It felt like order. The army, meanwhile, grew larger and more expensive. Soldiers were needed everywhere, along the Rhine, the Danube, in Britain, North Africa, and the East. To fill the ranks, Rome increasingly recruited non-Romans. Entire units were made up of people who had never lived under Roman law before joining it. They were paid, they were armed, they were loyal to commanders, not ideals. At the same time, the old Roman civic culture began to fade. City councils, once a prestigious position, became a burden. Local elites were expected to fund public works, collect taxes, and absorb losses personally. Many tried to avoid office. Some fled their cities entirely. Public buildings fell into disrepair not because Rome was poor, but because no one wanted responsibility anymore. Rome still ruled, but fewer people wanted to participate. When Diocletian retired voluntarily in 305 AD, it shocked everyone. Roman emperors didn't retire, they were killed. But Diocletian believed he had fixed the system. He stepped away to live quietly, convinced the machinery would run without him. It didn't. The carefully balanced tetrarchy collapsed into rivalry almost immediately. Emperors fought emperors. Armies picked sides. Civil war returned, not as chaos, but as routine. Out of that chaos emerged Constantine. Constantine didn't dismantle Diocletian's reforms. He refined them. He centralized power again, but kept the heavy bureaucracy intact. He founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople, closer to wealth, population, and trade. The West was not abandoned, but it was no longer the priority. Rome itself became symbolic. The emperor was rarely there. Decisions were made elsewhere. The Senate still existed, but its influence shrank. The city lived on reputation more than relevance. Constantine also made another quiet shift that mattered deeply. He legalized Christianity and later favored it. This didn't destroy Rome, but it changed the emotional center of the empire. Loyalty slowly moved from civic identity toward religious identity. People began to see themselves less as Romans of a city and more as members of a faith. Again, nothing collapsed. Life went on. Farmers planted crops. Merchants traveled shorter routes. Soldiers guarded borders. Laws were issued constantly. The empire still functioned, but it functioned more rigidly, more defensively, and with less room to adapt. In the West, cities slowly shrank. Trade declined. Roads were maintained less frequently. Coins became scarcer. Barter returned quietly in places where money once dominated. This wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. People didn't wake up one day to find the empire gone. They woke up to find fewer services, fewer officials, fewer repairs, a little less safety each year. The Western Roman Empire at this stage was not dying violently, it was aging, and aging under pressure. From the outside, it still looked like Rome. From the inside, it was already changing into something else. When Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire did not mourn him for long. It split, not formally, not cleanly, but practically. His sons divided control, argued, negotiated, and occasionally fought. This became the new normal. The empire was no longer one machine with one driver. It was a collection of parts moving at different speeds, held together by habit and fear. In the western provinces, that fear was growing. The army was still large, but it was stretched thin. Units were moved constantly to respond to emergencies. Garrisons that once stayed in one place for decades were rotated, weakened, or abandoned entirely. Borders that had once felt solid now felt porous. Along the Rhine and Danube, pressure never stopped. Groups labeled barbarians by Roman writers were not unified armies. They were families, clans, and loose confederations pushed by hunger, conflict, and climate. They weren't always trying to conquer Rome. Many wanted land, safety, or payment. Rome's response was inconsistent. Sometimes these groups were fought, sometimes they were bribed, sometimes they were settled inside the empire, as farmers or soldiers. Each solution worked briefly, none worked forever. To pay for defense, taxes climbed again. For people at the bottom, this was crushing. A bad harvest no longer meant a hard year. It meant debt, punishment, or flight. Entire villages quietly disappeared as people abandoned land that could no longer support them. The state did not collapse in response. It tightened control. Records from this period show endless laws about tax evasion, abandoned farms, runaway laborers, and officials failing to meet quotas. Rome was spending enormous energy trying to stop people from leaving systems that no longer worked for them. Cities continued to shrink. Public baths closed first, then theaters, then forums fell quiet. Not because people hated Rome, but because daily survival mattered more than civic life. In places like Gaul and Britain, trade routes shortened dramatically. Long-distance commerce became rare. Local production replaced empire-wide supply chains. This made communities more self-sufficient, but also more isolated. Rome's strength had always been connection. That was fading. The army felt these changes immediately. Soldiers were often paid late, or not at all. Equipment was reused far beyond its lifespan. Recruitment standards dropped. Loyalty shifted from the idea of Rome to individual commanders who could promise food, land, or protection. Some generals became more powerful than emperors. This made emperors nervous. Assassinations became common again. Emperors ruled briefly, cautiously, and often violently. Stability came in short bursts, followed by uncertainty. Then came the Goths. In the 300s and 70s, a massive movement of Gothic peoples reached Rome's borders, fleeing a new threat from the east, the Huns. They asked for asylum, land, safety. Rome agreed, and then mismanaged everything. Roman officials exploited the Goths, selling food at obscene prices, abusing leaders, and letting conditions deteriorate. Starvation spread, tensions rose. What had been refugees became rebels. In 378 AD, the Roman army met the Goths at Adrianople. It was a disaster. The Roman Emperor Valens was killed. Tens of thousands of trained soldiers were lost in a single day. The Eastern army recovered. The Western one never truly did. This battle didn't end Rome, but it shattered an illusion. Rome was no longer guaranteed victory in open battle. Its military superiority was no longer unquestioned. After Adrianople, Rome relied even more on negotiated settlements. Barbarian leaders were given titles, land, and commands. They were inside the system now, not outside it. This worked until interests diverged. By the end of the 4th century, the empire was still standing, but the western half was fragile. Its cities were smaller, its economy weaker, its army thinner and less loyal. Rome had survived worse crises before, but this time it was surviving by compromise instead of dominance. And compromise has limits. In 395 AD, the Roman Empire split permanently, not as an emergency measure, not as a temporary solution, but as a fact. When Emperor Theodosius I died, he left the Eastern Empire to his son Arcadius and the Western Empire to his other son Honorius. From that moment on, coordination between East and West became occasional, strained, and increasingly irrelevant. The Eastern Empire was richer, denser, and more urbanized. The Western Empire was poorer, more rural, and more exposed. This imbalance mattered. The Western government still collected taxes, but less efficiently. Coinage circulated unevenly. Many regions paid taxes in kind instead of money. The army depended heavily on land grants and promises rather than reliable pay. The capital of the West wasn't Rome anymore. It was Milan, then Ravenna. Ravenna was defensible. Surrounded by marshes, it was also isolated. Emperors there were safe but distant. Decisions took longer. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Meanwhile, powerful generals filled the vacuum. The most important of them was Stilicho. Stilicho was half Roman, half Vandal, and one of the last truly capable military leaders in the West. He spent years racing across collapsing frontiers, negotiating with invading groups, and keeping the Western Empire functioning through sheer effort. He didn't have enough troops. He didn't have enough money, but he had experience. For a while, that was enough. Then politics intervened. Court rivals accused Stilicho of treason. The emperor listened. In 408 AD, Stilicho was executed. His supporters were purged. Thousands of barbarian soldiers who had served Rome faithfully were massacred in Italian cities. Survivors fled straight into the arms of Rome's enemies. Almost immediately, consequences arrived. That same year, a Gothic leader named Alaric marched into Italy. Rome, the symbolic heart of the empire, was suddenly defenseless. In 410 AD, Alaric's forces entered Rome. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the city was sacked. The sack wasn't total destruction. Buildings still stood, people still lived, but the psychological impact was enormous. Rome was no longer untouchable. The idea of Roman permanence cracked. Refugees poured out of the city. Wealth vanished. Food shortages followed. Senators fled to countryside estates or foreign courts. Rome survived, but diminished. The Western government continued operating, but authority slipped further each year. Provinces began solving problems on their own. In Britain, Roman administration simply ended. Troops withdrew. Officials stopped arriving. Local leaders took over. The empire didn't fall there. It faded away. In Gaul and Spain, Roman authority coexisted with barbarian kingdoms. Visigoths, Vandals, and Burgundians ruled land in Rome's name, at least on paper. In practice, they answered to themselves. The army was now mostly composed of non-Roman soldiers commanded by non-Roman leaders. Loyalty was transactional. Land mattered more than ideology. Rome was no longer an empire that expanded. It was an empire that negotiated its own survival. Then came the Vandals. In 429 AD, a Vandal army crossed from Spain into North Africa. Rome's richest western province, its main grain supplier, fell with shocking speed. Carthage was taken. Rome lost control of its food supply. The effect was immediate. Grain shipments stopped. Prices spiked. Hunger spread in Italy. The government couldn't respond militarily. There were no spare armies left. In 455 AD, the Vandals sailed to Italy and entered Rome itself. This sack was worse than the first. Loot was systematic. Treasures accumulated over centuries were stripped away. The city was emptied of wealth that would never return. Rome remained inhabited, but it was now poor. The Western Empire still technically existed, but it no longer controlled its resources, its armies, or its future. What remained was inertia, and inertia doesn't last forever. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was still alive in name only. There was an emperor. There were laws. There were coins, stamped with imperial faces. But very little power remained behind them. After the sack of Rome in 455 AD, the Western government lost its last illusion of control. The Vandals returned to North Africa with Rome's wealth, its prisoners, and its leverage. The grain supply never fully recovered. Italy became dependent on unstable imports and local production that couldn't meet demand. Hunger didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in. Rations shrank. Prices rose. Cities thinned further as people drifted toward countryside estates owned by local strongmen who could still offer protection and food. The emperors themselves became disposable. Between 455 and 476, the Western throne changed hands constantly. Some emperors ruled for months, others barely a year. Most were elevated by generals and removed the same way. Few issued meaningful policy. None restored authority. Real power belonged to military commanders. The most important of these was Ricimer. Ricimer was a Germanic general who controlled the army in Italy. He made emperors. He destroyed emperors. He never became emperor himself because he knew the title no longer mattered. What mattered was command of troops. Rome had inverted itself. The emperor existed to legitimize the general, not the other way around. Outside Italy, the empire had already fragmented. Gaul was divided between Roman officials and barbarian kings who cooperated when convenient. Spain was largely controlled by Visigoths. North Africa belonged to the Vandals. Britain was gone entirely. The Western Empire did not reconquer these regions. It adjusted to losing them. Laws continued to be written for provinces Rome no longer governed. This wasn't denial. It was habit. The army shrank further. Recruitment relied almost entirely on barbarian groups settled within the empire. Payment was often land instead of wages. Soldiers became landlords. Military service became hereditary within non-Roman families. Roman identity diluted quietly. Latin was still spoken. Roman law still influenced courts, but loyalty to the idea of Rome meant less than loyalty to local rulers who actually enforced order. In the cities, life grew quieter. Public games stopped. Baths closed permanently. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Large buildings were dismantled for stone, not by invaders, but by residents who needed materials to survive. Rome wasn't being destroyed, it was being recycled. The city of Rome itself still held symbolic weight, but it no longer directed events. Emperors ruled from Ravenna. Generals ruled from wherever their armies stood. Local leaders governed day-to-day life. By the 470s, even the pretense of imperial authority felt unnecessary. In 476 AD, a Germanic officer named Odoacer led a revolt against the sitting emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Romulus was a teenager. He had no army. He had no support. He was removed without a battle. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople and ruled Italy as king instead. There was no Western replacement, no announcement, no ceremony, no final decree. The Western Roman Empire simply stopped appointing emperors. Most people barely noticed. Taxes were already local. Law was already fragmented. Protection already came from whoever controlled land and soldiers nearby. Life went on much as it had the day before. Rome did not fall in flames. It expired administratively. What survived was influence. Roman law shaped new kingdoms. Roman roads remained in use. Latin evolved into new languages. The church inherited much of the empire's structure and memory. The empire ended, but Rome did not vanish. It became quieter, smaller, less certain. And for most people living through it, the collapse wasn't a single moment. It was just a long adjustment to a world that slowly stopped calling itself Roman. Part 2. Rise of the Barbarian Kingdoms. When the Western Roman Empire stopped appointing emperors, nothing replaced it overnight. There was no new system announced, no new borders drawn, no clear moment when people were told their world had changed. Instead, power settled into the hands of people who were already there. They were called barbarians by Roman writers: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians. But by the late 5th century, most of these groups had been living near Rome, trading with Rome, fighting for Rome, and serving inside Roman armies for generations. They did not arrive to a functioning empire. They arrived to leftovers. Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were full of Roman roads that still worked, laws that still applied, and cities that still existed, but no longer had money, soldiers, or administrators to maintain them. Someone had to take over. In Italy, that person was Odoacer. Odoacer was not an invader in the traditional sense. He had served Rome. He commanded troops who had been paid with land instead of wages. When he removed Romulus Augustulus in 476, he did not sack Rome, burn buildings, or declare a new empire. He sent the imperial insignia east and ruled as king. This was a critical shift. For the first time, Italy was ruled by someone who openly accepted that the Western Roman Empire was over, but who had no interest in destroying Roman systems. Odoacer kept Roman officials in their positions. He enforced Roman law. He collected Roman taxes. To the average person, life did not feel radically different. If you were a farmer, you still paid rent or tax. If you were a city resident, you still obeyed local courts. If you were a landowner, you still relied on Roman legal customs to protect property. Rome no longer ruled, but Roman habits did. This pattern repeated across the former Western provinces. In Gaul, the Franks took control. Their leader, Clovis, ruled not as a conqueror smashing Roman culture, but as a king who adopted it. He converted to Christianity not because it was required, but because it gave him legitimacy over Roman populations who still trusted bishops more than warlords. Clovis issued laws in Latin. He relied on Roman administrators. He ruled over both Franks and Romans without erasing the difference. The result was strange but stable. Two legal systems existed side by side. Romans were judged under Roman law, Franks under Frankish custom. Identity mattered more than geography. In Spain and southern Gaul, the Visigoths did the same. They occupied Roman cities without destroying them. They taxed Roman landowners instead of replacing them. They issued written law codes modeled directly on Roman examples. Their kings lived in old Roman capitals and ruled through former imperial offices. These kingdoms were not anti-Roman, they were post-Roman. They had no interest in reviving the empire, but they relied on its remains to function. This was not because they admired Rome romantically. It was because Rome's systems were useful. Roman roads still connected markets. Roman law still organized property. Roman cities still anchored authority. The so-called barbarians did not bring chaos everywhere they went. In many places, they brought continuity, simply with fewer resources and less reach. But something important had changed. The idea of a single authority governing the entire West was gone. Power was local now. Kings ruled regions. Cities relied on nearby strongmen. Protection came from whoever could enforce it immediately. Rome had once promised order everywhere. Now, order existed only where someone was strong enough to maintain it. The transition was quiet, but permanent. The empire had dissolved into kingdoms, not because it was conquered, but because there was nothing left to conquer. By the early 6th century, the Western Roman Empire was gone, but its shadow was everywhere. The new rulers did not see themselves as destroyers of Rome. Many of them saw themselves as its caretakers. They ruled Roman land over Roman people, using Roman systems that still mostly worked, at least on the surface. They copied Rome because Rome was the only model of power anyone remembered. In Italy, after Odoacer was removed, power passed to Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. Theodoric had been raised in Constantinople as a political hostage. He spoke Latin. He understood Roman law. He admired Roman order. When he ruled Italy, he did so carefully. He kept the Roman Senate. He preserved Roman courts. He maintained aqueducts, roads, and grain shipments. To Roman elites, Theodoric presented himself as a traditional ruler, not a barbarian conqueror. He wore Roman dress. He issued laws in Roman style. He ruled as king, but behaved like an emperor. For a while, it worked. Italy experienced relative stability under Theodoric. Cities functioned, trade continued at reduced levels, aristocrats kept their estates, churches expanded their influence. Compared to the chaos of the late 5th century, this felt like recovery. But the appearance of continuity hid a serious problem. Rome's old systems depended on scale. They worked when taxes flowed from dozens of provinces. They worked when armies were centrally funded. They worked when trade crossed continents. The barbarian kingdoms ruled fragments of that world. Tax revenue was smaller. Coinage was scarce. Bureaucracy existed, but thinly. Officials were fewer, records incomplete, enforcement uneven. Kings ruled through personal authority, not institutions. If a ruler was strong and competent, the system held. If not, it unraveled quickly. In Gaul, Clovis and his successors faced the same challenge. They controlled territory but lacked administrative depth. Much of governance relied on negotiation with local elites, bishops, and landowners who were already accustomed to acting independently. This created a fragile balance. Kings needed Roman administrators. Administrators needed royal protection. Neither side fully trusted the other. Law itself began to shift. Roman law had once applied universally. Now it became identity-based. Romans were judged under Roman law. Goths, Franks, and Burgundians under their own customs. Justice depended on who you were, not where you lived. This reduced conflict in the short term. It weakened unity in the long term. The army reflected this change as well. Roman legions no longer existed in their old form. Military power was organized around warbands loyal to kings. Service was rewarded with land, not salary. Soldiers fought for leaders they knew personally, not for an abstract state. This made armies flexible, but unstable. If a king died, loyalty dissolved. If land was disputed, violence followed. There was no longer a neutral authority to appeal to. The Eastern Roman Empire, now centered in Constantinople, watched this quietly. It still considered itself Roman. It still claimed sovereignty over the West, but for decades it did nothing, until it decided to try. By the 10th century, Rome had stopped being a reference point for daily life. It still existed in books, prayers, and ruined stone, but it no longer explained how power worked. The kingdoms that emerged from Rome's collapse had settled into their own logic. Authority was no longer borrowed from the past. It was built from what actually functioned in the present. Power became layered. At the top were kings, but their reach was limited. Below them were dukes, counts, and local lords who controlled land directly. Beneath them were peasants who lived, worked, and survived almost entirely within a few miles of where they were born. This wasn't an accident. It was the natural result of a world without empire-scale systems. Communication was slow, roads still existed, but maintenance was uneven. Travel was risky. Armies could not be fed far from home. Taxes were difficult to collect beyond local areas. Central authority faded because it couldn't be enforced. Instead, protection became the currency of power. If a lord could defend a village from raiders, bandits, or rival nobles, that lord mattered. If he couldn't, his title meant nothing. Loyalty flowed toward whoever could act immediately, not whoever claimed distant legitimacy. This was the final break from Rome. Rome had promised universal order. The medieval world promised personal security. Law followed the same path. Roman legal ideas survived, but they were now filtered through local custom, church teaching, and precedent. Courts became personal affairs. Witnesses mattered more than documents. Oaths mattered more than statutes. Justice wasn't uniform. It was familiar. People accepted this because it worked better than distant systems that no longer existed. Economically, the West stabilized at a lower level of complexity. Long-distance trade slowly returned in limited forms, but it never resembled the Roman economy. Markets were regional, production was local, coinage existed, but barter remained common. Cities began to recover, but differently. They grew around castles, churches, and markets, not forums and baths. Urban life was shaped by defense and trade, not civic identity. The Roman idea of the city as a political organism was gone. Religion filled the remaining gaps. The church became the only institution with continuity across centuries. It preserved literacy, it preserved memory, it provided a shared framework of meaning across fragmented kingdoms. But even the church no longer spoke of restoring Rome. It spoke of salvation, order, and morality, things that mattered in a fractured world. By this point, the word Roman meant many things. It meant old. It meant authoritative, it meant prestigious, but it no longer meant how things are done. The barbarian kingdoms had stopped pretending to inherit Rome, they had finished transforming it. What emerged wasn't chaos or decline, it was a different kind of civilization. Smaller, slower, more personal. Rome's collapse didn't end history, it redistributed it. The empire had once organized the West around a single center. Its absence allowed many centers to exist at once. Kings, lords, bishops, and cities shaped their own futures without waiting for imperial approval. Rome didn't return because it wasn't needed anymore. The world had learned how to function without it. And that, more than any battle or invasion, is what finally ended the Roman age.